The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of Wayne County Courthouse as Rosa Martinez adjusted the tiny backpack on her 3-year-old granddaughter's shoulders. Emma's small fingers gripped her grandmother's hand with the fierce determination only toddlers possess, her wide brown eyes reflecting a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty as she gazed up at the imposing limestone building that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the Detroit sky. "Abuela, why is this place so big?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the morning traffic and the steady stream of people climbing the courthouse steps. Her tiny sneakers, decorated with cartoon princesses, seemed almost comically small against the massive stone steps that had witnessed decades of justice, heartbreak, and hope. Rosa's weathered hands trembled slightly as she clutched the manila envelope containing the custody modification papers for Emma's older brother, Carlos. At 62, she had never imagined she would find herself navigating the complex world of family court. But life had a way of presenting challenges when you least expected them. The legal jargon in the documents might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphics, but Rosa understood one thing perfectly. She was fighting to keep her family together. The metal detectors at the courthouse entrance created a bottleneck of humanity, lawyers in expensive suits checking their phones. Impatiently, families huddled together speaking in hushed tones, and court officers maintaining order with practiced efficiency. Emma's eyes widened as she watched purses and briefcases disappear into the X-ray machine, emerging on the other side like magic tricks she couldn't quite understand. "Next," called the security officer, a kind-faced woman whose nameplate read, "Officer Johnson." Rosa approached nervously, placing her purse in the plastic bin while Emma clung to her leg, suddenly shy in the face of official authority. The metal detector beeped softly as they passed through, and Officer Johnson smiled down at Emma with the warmth of someone who had seen thousands of frightened children pass through these doors. "First time at the big courthouse, sweetheart?" Officer Johnson asked, crouching down to Emma's level. The little girl nodded solemnly, her thumb finding its way to her mouth, a habit Rosa had been trying to break for months. "Don't worry, honey. It's just a big building where people come to solve their problems, like a really fancy puzzle house." Emma's expression brightened slightly at this explanation, and she removed her thumb long enough to ask, "Do they have toys here?" Officer Johnson chuckled, the sound echoing off the marble walls that had heard far more serious conversations than a toddler's innocent question. "Not exactly toys, little one, but there's a children's area with books and coloring pages near Courtroom 4B, the officer explained, pointing down a long corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced judges from decades past. "Your grandma knows where to go." As they made their way through the courthouse lobby, Emma's attention was captured by everything around her. The ceiling seemed impossibly high, with ornate moldings that reminded her of the fancy church her grandmother sometimes took her to on Sundays. The marble floors were so polished she could almost see her reflection, and her footsteps created tiny echoes that fascinated her endlessly. "Abuela, why is everyone talking so quiet?" Emma observed, noticing how people seemed to lower their voices the moment they stepped inside the building. It was true there was an almost reverent quality to the atmosphere, as if the weight of the law itself demanded hushed tones and serious expressions. Rosa squeezed her granddaughter's hand reassuringly. "This is a place where important decisions are made, Mia. People speak softly because they want to show respect." She didn't mention that she herself felt intimidated by the formal atmosphere, or that her limited English made her worry about understanding everything that would happen during the hearing. They found seats on a long wooden bench outside Courtroom 4B, joining a diverse group of families, all waiting for their cases to be called. Emma swung her legs back and forth, her feet not quite touching the ground, while Rosa reviewed her papers. For the 100th time that morning. The custody modification should have been straightforward. Carlos was doing well in school, had no behavioral problems, and clearly thrived under his grandmother's care. But the boy's father had recently filed objections, claiming he wanted to reassert his parental rights, despite having been absent for most of Carlos's life. A young mother sat nearby with twin boys who appeared to be about 5 years old, both fidgeting restlessly as they waited. An elderly man in a rumpled suit shuffled through a stack of documents, occasionally muttering to himself in frustration. Across from them, a teenage girl sat with what appeared to be a court-appointed guardian, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Emma absorbed all of these details with the keen observational skills that only young children possess, filing away information. She didn't yet understand, but would remember with startling clarity. She noticed how the teenage girl kept checking her phone, how the elderly man's hands shook slightly as he turned pages, how her own grandmother's breathing seemed faster than normal. "Are you scared, Abuela?" Emma asked with a directness that often startled adults who forgot how perceptive children could be. Rosa looked down at her granddaughter, seeing her own fears reflected in those innocent brown eyes. "A little bit, Mia, but we're going to be brave together, okay? Sometimes grown-ups have to do scary things to protect the people they love." Emma nodded solemnly, as if she understood the weight of her grandmother's words. She reached into her small backpack and pulled out her favorite stuffed animal, a raggedy unicorn named Sparkles that had seen better days. "Sparkles will help us be brave," she announced, making Rosa smile despite her anxiety. Neither of them could have imagined that within the next hour, this routine court visit would transform into something extraordinary. Emma's innocent presence in that courthouse corridor was about to intersect with forces she couldn't possibly understand, setting in motion a series of events that would change multiple lives forever. The little girl who was simply trying to help her grandmother be brave was about to become the most important witness in a case that had stumped Detroit police for over a year. But for now, she was just a 3-year-old girl sitting on a hard wooden bench, clutching her stuffed unicorn and trying to make sense of the serious adult world swirling around her. The courthouse corridor had settled into a familiar rhythm of hushed conversations and rustling papers when the sound of confident footsteps echoed from around the corner near the elevator bank. Officer Jake Sullivan, a 12-year veteran of the Detroit Police Department, rounded the bend with his 4-legged partner trotting contentedly beside him. At first glance, the pair looked like any other law enforcement team, but those who knew recognized something special about this partnership. Ranger, a magnificent golden retriever with a coat that caught the fluorescent lighting like spun gold, wore his official therapy dog vest with unmistakable pride. The navy blue vest, emblazoned with the Detroit Police Department emblem and therapy. DOG, do not pet without permission, in bold white letters, marked him as something extraordinary in the world of law enforcement. For 2 years, this gentle giant had been working the courthouse circuit, providing comfort to traumatized witnesses, anxious children, and overwhelmed families navigating the complex judicial system. Officer Sullivan, a soft-spoken man in his early 40s with kind eyes that had seen too much, but somehow maintained their compassion, guided Ranger down the corridor with practiced ease. They were heading to Courtroom 2A, where a particularly difficult child custody case involving allegations of abuse was scheduled to begin. The 8-year-old witness had specifically requested Ranger's presence after meeting him during a preliminary interview last week. As they approached the seating area outside Courtroom 4B, the usual magic began to happen. A little boy, perhaps 6 years old, looked up from his coloring book and gasped with delight. "Mommy, look! A police dog!" he whispered excitedly, tugging on his mother's sleeve. His mother, a tired-looking woman clutching a folder of legal documents, managed a small smile, the first genuine expression of joy Officer Sullivan had seen from her all morning. two teenage girls sitting with what appeared to be a social worker immediately perked up, their previous sullen expressions replaced with curiosity and wonder. Even the elderly man who had been muttering over his paperwork looked up with interest, his weathered face softening as he watched Ranger's gentle approach. This was why Officer Sullivan loved his assignment with a therapy dog unit. In a building where people came to face some of the worst moments of their lives, divorces, custody battles, criminal proceedings, civil suits, Ranger represented something pure and healing. The golden retriever had an almost supernatural ability to sense distress and respond with exactly the right amount of comfort, whether that meant a gentle nuzzle, a calm presence, or simply lying down nearby to provide silent support. "Can I pet him?" asked a young mother holding a baby, her voice carrying the hope that maybe something good could happen in this place of difficult decisions. Officer Sullivan smiled and began his practiced response, explaining Ranger's role and the proper way to interact with a working therapy dog. But as his eyes swept across the waiting families, something caught his attention that made his trained instincts sharpen. At the far end of the bench, a little girl had gone completely rigid. Unlike the other children who were leaning forward with excitement or whispering questions to their parents, this tiny figure pressed herself back against the wooden bench as if trying to disappear into it entirely. Emma Martinez, who moments before had been swinging her legs and chattering quietly with her grandmother about the interesting people around them, had transformed into a statue of pure terror. Her small body trembled with such intensity that Sparkles, the stuffed unicorn in her lap, seemed to vibrate along with her. The color had drained from her face, leaving her looking almost ghostly in the harsh courthouse lighting. Rosa felt the change immediately. The warm, curious child who had been asking questions about everything around them had suddenly gone silent, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "Mia, what's wrong?" Rosa whispered in Spanish, instinctively pulling Emma closer to her side. But Emma couldn't respond. Her wide brown eyes were locked on Ranger with a focus so intense it seemed to burn. This wasn't the delighted stare of a child seeing a friendly dog. This was the transfixed gaze of someone confronting their worst nightmare made manifest. Every muscle in her tiny body was coiled tight, as if preparing to run or fight, though she seemed frozen in place by fear too overwhelming to process. Officer Sullivan noticed the change in the corridor's atmosphere. The excited whispers of other children continued, but there was a new tension in the air, an electric sense that something was wrong. His eyes found the source, a little girl whose reaction to Ranger was unlike anything he had encountered in 2 years of therapy dog work. Ranger, with the intuitive sensitivity that made him exceptional at his job, also sensed the disturbance. The golden retriever's ears pricked forward, and he turned his gentle brown eyes toward Emma with concern rather than his usual friendly interest. His tail, which had been wagging softly moments before, stilled completely. In his canine wisdom, he understood that his presence was causing distress rather than comfort, though he couldn't comprehend why. The other families in the waiting area began to notice the unusual scene unfolding. The excited chatter about the police doggy faded as people became aware of the frightened child who seemed to be having some kind of panic attack. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as all eyes turned toward the grandmother desperately trying to comfort a little girl who appeared to be seeing something terrifying that no one else could perceive. Officer Sullivan had dealt with children who were afraid of dogs before. It wasn't uncommon, and Ranger was trained to handle such situations by maintaining distance and allowing the child to observe from a safe space until they felt more comfortable. But this was different. This child wasn't just afraid. She was traumatized in a way that spoke to something deeper and more troubling than simple canine phobia. Emma's breathing became even more labored, small gasping sounds escaping her lips as she pressed herself harder against her grandmother's side. Her tiny fingers clutched sparkles so tightly that her knuckles turned white, and tears began streaming down her cheeks, though she made no sound of crying. Rosa's own heart began racing as she recognized the signs of one of Emma's episodes, the same kind of panic attacks that had plagued her granddaughter during the first weeks after coming to live with her. The child psychologist Dr. Martinez had warned her that certain triggers might cause Emma to relive traumatic memories, but they had never identified what those triggers might be. The corridor fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of Emma's distressed breathing and the soft jingle of Ranger's collar as Officer Sullivan debated whether to move his partner away from the area. Every instinct told him that something significant was happening here, something that went far beyond a simple fear of dogs. In that moment of suspended tension, with all eyes focused on the terrified 3-year-old, no one could have predicted that they were witnessing the first crack in a case that had stumped Detroit's finest for over a year. The little girl shaking on the courthouse bench was about to become the key to unlocking one of the city's most disturbing criminal enterprises. The tension in the courthouse corridor had reached a breaking point. Emma's small body continued to tremble against her grandmother's protective embrace, tears streaming silently down her cheeks as she stared at Ranger with an intensity that seemed to pierce through time itself. The golden retriever remained perfectly still, his professional training keeping him calm despite the palpable distress radiating from the little girl 20 feet away. Officer Sullivan found himself in uncharted territory. In his 2 years working with Ranger in therapeutic settings, he had encountered children who were initially nervous around dogs, some who needed time to warm up, and a few who simply preferred to maintain their distance. But he had never witnessed a reaction like this pure, primal terror that seemed to recognize something specific about his gentle partner that no one else could see. Rosa whispered soft reassurances in Spanish, her weathered hands stroking Emma's dark hair as she tried to understand what was happening to her granddaughter. "Está bien, mi amor. Estás segura conmigo," she murmured, but her own voice betrayed her growing panic. The child psychologist had warned her about potential triggers, but nothing in Emma's limited explanations of her past had prepared Rosa for this moment. The other families in the waiting area watched in uncomfortable silence, their own legal troubles momentarily forgotten as they witnessed something that felt both deeply personal and universally heart-wrenching. A young mother with the baby unconsciously pulled her child closer, while the teenage girls who had been excited about seeing Ranger now looked concerned and confused. It was then, in that moment of suspended silence, that Emma found her voice. Her small right hand, still clutching Sparkles the unicorn, slowly lifted from her lap. Every eye in the corridor followed that tiny finger as it extended toward Ranger with the deliberate precision of someone identifying a criminal in a police lineup. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, suddenly steadied as if she was gathering every ounce of courage in her 3-year-old soul. "Bad dog." The words exploded from Emma's lips with such unexpected force and clarity that they seemed to echo off the marble walls like gunshots. The sound cut through the hushed courthouse atmosphere like a blade, sharp and undeniable. Officer Sullivan felt as if he'd been physically struck, his hand instinctively moving to steady himself against the wall. "Bad dog, bad dog," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with each repetition, as if speaking the words was breaking through some terrible spell that had held her silent for months. Her small body, which had been rigid with terror, suddenly animated with desperate energy as she pulled away from her grandmother's protective embrace. The transformation was stunning. Gone was the trembling, silent child who had been frozen by fear. In her place stood a tiny warrior, pointing accusingly at a therapy dog who had never received anything but praise and affection in his entire career. Emma's voice carried a conviction that transcended her age. each word delivered with the certainty of someone who had witnessed something unspeakable. Rosa gasped, her own hands shaking as she tried to process what was happening. In the 4 months Emma had been living with her, the child had never spoken with such intensity about anything. The little girl who usually whispered and needed coaxing to speak above a murmur was now declaring something with the force of absolute truth. "Mia, no," Rosa attempted to intervene, embarrassed by the scene her granddaughter was creating. "He's an perro bueno. He's a good dog, sweetheart." But Emma was beyond comfort, beyond reasoning, locked in some terrible recognition that made her entire being reject the golden retriever's presence. Officer Sullivan's mind raced as he processed the unprecedented situation. Ranger had undergone extensive temperament testing, had worked with hundreds of traumatized individuals, and had never once displayed anything approaching aggressive behavior. The accusation felt like a personal attack on his partner's character. But something in the child's absolute certainty made him pause before dismissing her words. The corridor had become a theater of confused whispers and concerned faces. The elderly man shuffling his legal papers had stopped entirely, his mouth slightly open as he watched the drama unfold. Court personnel began emerging from nearby offices, drawn by the commotion of a 3-year-old's voice echoing through halls, typically governed by hushed tones and formal procedure. Among those drawn to the scene was Detective Maria Santos, a 15-year veteran of the Detroit Police Department who had been waiting to testify in an unrelated domestic violence case in Courtroom. 2C Santos had spent her career learning to read situations, and every instinct honed by years of investigative work was now focused on the little girl whose accusations were creating such unprecedented chaos. Emma continued her declarations, her small voice now carrying a desperate quality that spoke of urgent truth-telling. Bad dog, hurts the other doggies." This additional detail hit the corridor like a second shockwave, providing context. That transformed her seemingly irrational outburst into something far more specific and troubling. Detective Santos felt her pulse quicken. The phrase "hurts the other doggies" wasn't typical 3-year-old vocabulary. It spoke to exposure to situations no child should witness, experiences that would explain the depth of trauma she was observing. Her detective's mind began cataloging possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Ranger, displaying the emotional intelligence that made him exceptional at his job, slowly lowered himself to the floor in a submissive position, his professional training overriding any confusion about why this child saw him as a threat. His gentle brown eyes remained fixed on Emma with an expression that seemed almost apologetic, as if he understood that his very presence was causing her pain. Officer Sullivan found himself at a complete loss. His partner's reaction immediately, submitting to defuse the situation only, highlighted how extraordinary Emma's accusation truly was. Dogs didn't lie down submissively unless they sensed genuine distress or perceived themselves as a threat. Ranger's behavior suggested that on some level, the therapy dog understood that Emma's fear was real and justified, even if no one else could comprehend why. The little girl's breathing gradually began to slow, but her finger remained pointed at Ranger with unwavering determination. Her tears had stopped, replaced by a fierce expression that seemed far too old for her small face. She had spoken her truth, identified her threat, and now waited to see if the adults around her would believe what she was telling them. In that moment, suspended between confusion and revelation, no one in the courthouse corridor could have predicted that Emma's 2 words would become the key to unlocking one of Detroit's most disturbing criminal cases. The bad dog she had identified wasn't Ranger himself, but rather a recognition triggered by breed, circumstance, and traumatic memory that would soon lead investigators to a horror no child should ever have witnessed. The silence that followed Emma's declarations was pregnant with possibility. each adult processing the scene through their own lens of experience and understanding. But it was Detective Santos who would first recognize that sometimes the most important testimonies come from the most unlikely witnesses, and that truth often emerges from the mouths of those too young to lie. Detective Maria Santos had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people during her 15 years with the Detroit Police Department. She could spot a lie from across a crowded room, identify potential witnesses in chaotic crime scenes, and sense when seemingly innocent situations contained darker truths. As she watched the extraordinary scene unfolding in the courthouse corridor, every investigative instinct she possessed was screaming that this 3-year-old girl held information that could change everything, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that traumatized witnesses could shut down at the slightest wrong move. Detective Santos approached Rosa and Emma. Her badge was clipped discreetly to her belt, visible but not prominent enough to add to the child's obvious distress. At 42, Santos had learned that her petite stature and gentle demeanor often made her less intimidating to victims than her male colleagues, and she used these advantages strategically. "Ma'am," she said softly to Rosa, keeping her voice low and non-threatening, "I'm Detective Santos with the Detroit Police. I couldn't help but notice your granddaughter's reaction to the therapy dog. Would it be possible for us to speak privately for just a moment?" Rosa's eyes darted nervously between the detective's kind face and Emma, who had finally stopped pointing, but remained vigilant, her small body still coiled with tension. The older woman's limited English made her hesitant to engage with law enforcement, memories of her own childhood in El Salvador, making her instinctively wary of authority figures who asked too many questions. We are not in trouble?" Rosa asked carefully, her accent thick with worry. "Emma, she is just scared. Sometimes she has, como se dice, episodes. The doctor, he says it is normal for children who have seen bad things." Detective Santos felt her pulse quicken at this admission. "No, ma'am, you're not in trouble at all. But what you just said about Emma seeing bad things, that's exactly what I'd like to understand better. May I sit down?" With Rosa's hesitant nod, Santos settled herself on the bench beside them, deliberately positioning herself at Emma's eye level. The little girl watched her with the hyper-vigilant attention that the detective recognized from countless interviews. With trauma victims always scanning for threats, always ready to flee. "Emma," Santos said gently in Spanish, switching to the language she'd learned growing up in Detroit's southwest side. "My name is Maria, just like your abuela Maria, yes?" The use of Spanish seemed to relax both grandmother and granddaughter slightly, though Emma remained silent, her dark eyes studying this new adult with careful attention. "Can you tell me about the dogs you've seen before?" Santos continued in Spanish, watching Emma's face for micro-expressions that might reveal important information. "Not this dog here, he's a good dog who helps people. But maybe you've seen other dogs that weren't so nice?" Emma's reaction was immediate and telling. Her small body tensed again as she pressed closer to her grandmother while shaking her head violently. "No dogs," she whispered in Spanish. "No more dogs." But Detective Santos had caught something crucial in Emma's response. The phrase "no more dogs" implied there had been dogs before, multiple dogs, and the experience had been traumatic enough that she wanted to ensure it never happened again. This wasn't a simple phobia. This was learned fear based on specific, terrible experiences. Rosa's weathered hand smoothed Emma's hair protectively as she began to share what little she knew. "Detective, Emma came to live with me 4 months ago. Her mother Mihija. She has problems with drugs, you understand? When child services took Emma from that house, she was not talking at all. For weeks, nothing. Then slowly, just a few words here and there. 4 months. Detective Santos's mind immediately began calculating timelines. 4 months ago would have been early May, which coincided perfectly with several disturbing incidents. The Detroit police had been investigating in the Corktown and southwest Detroit areas. There had been reports of illegal dog fighting operations, anonymous tips about animal cruelty, and 3 separate cases of abandoned dogs found with injuries consistent with forced fighting. Mrs. Martinez, Santos said carefully, "Can you tell me what neighborhood Emma was living in before she came to stay with you?" "Corktown," Rosa replied, the single word carrying weight that made Santos's breath catch. "Near the old train station. Very bad area, very dangerous. The house where my daughter was staying Dios mio. It was no place for a baby. Corktown. The same neighborhood where they'd been tracking suspicious activity related to underground dog fighting for the past 6 months. The same area where witnesses had reported unusual numbers of injured dogs, strange noises at night, and groups of men gathering around what appeared to be illegal gambling operations. Detective Santos felt pieces of a complex puzzle beginning to align in her mind. Emma's terror at seeing Ranger wasn't about this specific dog. It was about what Ranger represented. The golden retriever's breed, size, and possibly even his calm demeanor might have triggered memories of other dogs the child had encountered in circumstances too traumatic for her young mind to fully process or articulate. "Emma," Santos said, gently, switching back to Spanish and keeping her tone as non-threatening as possible. "When you lived in that other house, were there dogs there sometimes?" The little girl's response was so subtle that someone without Santos's training might have missed it entirely. Emma's breathing changed, becoming rapid and shallow again, and her grip on Sparkles, the unicorn, tightened until her knuckles went white. She didn't speak, but she nodded, just barely, a tiny movement that confirmed Santos's growing suspicions. "Many dogs?" Santos pressed gently. Another microscopic nod. "Were the dogs sad?" This time, Emma's response was unmistakable. Tears began flowing down her cheeks again as she buried her face against her grandmother's shoulder. But before she hid, Santos caught her whispered response. "Muy tristes, very sad dogs." Rosa looked confused and concerned by this line of questioning, clearly not understanding the significance of what her granddaughter was revealing. "Detective, I don't understand. What does this have to do with Emma being afraid of the police dog?" Santos's mind was racing now, connecting dots that had been scattered across multiple case files for months. If Emma had been living in a house where dog fighting was taking place, she would have witnessed horrors that could traumatize an adult, let alone a toddler. The sounds of animals in pain, the sight of injured dogs, the presence of violent men who treated living creatures as disposable commodities, all of this would create exactly the kind of deep, specific trauma she was observing. "Mrs. Martinez, this might be very important," Santos explained carefully. "We've been investigating some illegal activities in that neighborhood involving dogs. If Emma witnessed something, even if she was very young, her memories could help. You stop bad people from hurting more animals." But even as she spoke, Santos knew they were treading on delicate ground. Emma was barely 3 years old, already traumatized, and any attempt to extract detailed information would need to be handled with extreme care by specialists trained in childhood psychology and trauma response. As if reading her thoughts, Emma suddenly looked up from her grandmother's shoulder and spoke directly to Detective Santos with a clarity that was startling. "The men hurt the doggies. They make them fight. I hide, but I see." The corridor seemed to go silent around them. Even Rosa gasped, hearing her granddaughter articulate something she had never mentioned before. In that moment, Detective Santos realized she wasn't just dealing with a traumatized child. She was potentially looking at the key witness to one of Detroit's most elusive criminal operations. the little girl who had been too frightened to speak about her past had just handed them the breakthrough they'd been searching for, and Santos knew that everything was about to change. 2 hours later, Detective Santos found herself in a specially designed interview room that looked nothing like the sterile interrogation spaces most people associated with police work. The walls were painted in soft pastels, child-sized furniture dotted the room, and shelves lined with toys, books, and art supplies created an atmosphere more reminiscent of a daycare center than a law enforcement facility. This was the Detroit Police Department's Child Advocacy Center, where specially trained professionals helped young victims process trauma while gathering crucial evidence. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic child psychologist with 20 years of experience, had responded to Santos's urgent call within an hour. At 55, Dr. Walsh possessed a rare combination of maternal warmth and scientific precision that made her invaluable in cases involving child witnesses. She understood that a 3-year-old's testimony required techniques completely different from traditional investigative methods, and that rushing the process could re-traumatize the child while destroying any hope of useful information. Emma sat at a small table covered with drawing paper and crayons. Her grandmother Rosa positioned supportively nearby in a chair specifically placed to be visible but not intrusive. Sparkles the unicorn maintained her position as Emma's primary source of comfort, while a video camera discreetly recorded everything from an angle that wouldn't intimidate the little girl. "Emma," Dr. Walsh said gently in Spanish, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who had guided hundreds of children through similar conversations. "I have some special paper here, and lots of colors. Would you like to draw me a picture of something you remember?" The approach was deceptively simple, but Dr. Walsh knew that children Emma's age often expressed traumatic memories more easily through art than words. Drawing engaged different parts of the brain, sometimes bypassing the psychological defenses that prevented verbal recounting of painful experiences. Emma picked up a brown crayon and began drawing with the focused intensity that young children brought to their artwork. Her small hand moved across the paper in deliberate strokes, creating shapes that gradually became recognizable as a large rectangular structure. Dr. Walsh and Detective Santos exchanged glances as they watched the image emerge. What appeared to be a building with multiple levels and small rectangular spaces that could be interpreted as rooms or kajis. "That's a very good drawing, Emma," Dr. Walsh encouraged. "Can you tell me about this place you've drawn?" Emma's response was barely audible, her voice dropping to a whisper as she continued adding details to her picture. "Dark place, cold place. The doggies live there, but they don't want to." She reached for a black crayon and began filling in sections of her drawing, creating areas of shadow that seemed to represent the oppressive atmosphere she remembered. Then, with deliberate precision, she added small circles within the rectangular spaces. Eyes, Dr. Walsh realized, the eyes of animals trapped in confined spaces. "Were you in this dark place sometimes, Emma?" Dr. Walsh asked carefully, monitoring the child's body language for signs of escalating distress. Emma nodded without looking up from her drawing. "Mama went there. I had to go too. She said stay quiet, stay hidden. So I hid behind the big box and watched." The implications of this revelation hit Detective Santos like a physical blow. If Emma's mother had been involved with the dog fighting operation as a participant, customer, or even just someone seeking drugs from the criminals running the enterprise, she would have brought her toddler into an environment of incredible violence and trauma. The fact that Emma had been instructed to hide suggested her mother was aware of the danger, but continued to expose her child to it anyway. Dr. Walsh guided Emma through describing more details of her drawing, each revelation building a clearer picture of what the child had witnessed. Emma added more figures to her artwork, stick figure representations of men she described as loud and mean, And most disturbingly, multiple dogs she drew with scribbled red marks that clearly represented injuries. "Emma," Dr. Walsh said, gently, "can you tell me about the men in your picture? Did they do things to the dogs?" Emma's crayon paused mid-stroke, and her breathing became shallow again. But instead of shutting down as they feared she might, she reached for a red crayon and began adding more aggressive marks to her drawing jagged lines that could represent fighting, pain, or violence. "They made the doggies fight each other," she said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone children sometimes used when describing horrors they didn't fully understand. The doggies didn't want to fight, but the men made them. Some doggies got very hurt. Some doggies went to sleep and didn't wake up. The euphemistic language couldn't mask the reality of what Emma was describing. Detective Santos felt her hands clench involuntarily as she realized this 3-year-old had witnessed not just animal cruelty, but the systematic torture and murder of dogs for entertainment and profit. Dr. Walsh maintained her professional composure, but Santos could see the controlled anger in the psychologist's eyes. "Emma, that must have been very scary to see. Were you scared when you were hiding?" "Very scared," Emma confirmed, now adding more details to one particular figure in her drawing. "But I had to be quiet, or the Spider-Man would be mad." "Spider-Man?" Dr. Walsh asked, her tone carefully neutral despite the significance of this detail. Emma looked up from her drawing for the first time since beginning the session, her dark eyes meeting Dr. Walsh's with startling directness. The man with the spider on his neck. He was the boss of the mean men. He had big teeth like a monster. And when he smiled, all the other men got scared too. Detective Santos's pulse quickened dramatically. A man with a spider tattoo on his neck, who appeared to be in charge of a dog-fighting operation, matched the description of Miguel, Spider Hernandez, a suspect they'd been tracking for months in connection with multiple criminal enterprises throughout Detroit's underground scene. Hernandez had been linked to illegal gambling, drug distribution, and suspected animal cruelty, but they'd never been able to gather enough evidence for charges that would stick. Emma returned to her drawing now, adding details to the Spider-Man figure with an accuracy that was both impressive and disturbing. She drew the tattoo as a black mark on the figure's neck, added what appeared to be gold teeth in his mouth, and even included details about his clothing that could prove valuable for identification purposes. "Emma," Dr. Walsh continued gently, "did the Spider-Man say things that you remember? Did he have a scary voice?" "He yelled at the doggies," Emma replied, her small hand now trembling slightly as she added more red marks to her drawing. "He said bad words that Mama told me never to say. And he hurt the doggies when they didn't want to fight. He had a stick that made the doggies scream." The clinical term for what Emma was describing was a shock prod or cattle prod tools commonly used in illegal dog fighting to force animals into aggressive behavior. The fact that a 3-year-old could accurately describe such implements suggested her exposure to this criminal world had been extensive and repeated. As the session continued, Emma's drawings became more detailed and disturbing. She drew what appeared to be a basement setting with multiple cage-like structures, crowds of adults who appeared to be spectators, and most heartbreakingly, numerous dogs in various states of distress and injury. Her artistic skills might have been those of a typical toddler, but the content revealed memories of experiences no child should ever have endured. By the end of the 2-hour session, Dr. Walsh and Detective Santos had gathered information that would prove invaluable to the ongoing investigation. Emma's innocent observations, filtered through a child's perspective, but remarkably detailed in their accuracy, provided crucial intelligence about the structure, location, and key personnel of Detroit's most elusive criminal enterprise. The little girl who had been too traumatized to speak about her past had become their most important witness, and her courage in sharing these painful memories would soon lead to the justice both she and the countless animal victims deserved. The emergency briefing room at Detroit Police Headquarters buzzed with controlled tension as Detective Santos spread Emma's drawings across the conference table like pieces of a complex jigsaw puzzle. Captain Robert Hayes, a 28-year veteran who had seen every type of criminal enterprise Detroit had to offer, studied the crude but remarkably detailed artwork with growing amazement. Around the table sat members of the Animal Cruelty Task Force, the Gang Intelligence Unit, and the Major Crimes Division, all departments that had been working fragments of this case for months without realizing they were hunting the same criminal organization. "These drawings," Captain Hayes said slowly, pointing to Emma's depiction of the basement fighting arena, "match the architectural layout of the abandoned Corktown warehouse we've been surveilling for 6 weeks. Look at this, she's drawn the support columns in exactly the right positions. And this area here," he tapped a section of Emma's artwork, "corresponds to the loading dock where we've documented unusual late-night activity." Detective Mike Torres, Santos's partner for the past 3 years, leaned forward to examine Emma's drawing of the Spider-Man more closely. "Santos, I think our 3-year-old witness just solved the Hernandez identification problem we've been struggling with for months. Look at these details, the gold teeth, the spider tattoo placement on the left side of his neck, even the description of his clothing preferences. This is intelligence we couldn't have gotten from months of traditional surveillance." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. For over a year, the Detroit Police Department had been receiving anonymous tips about illegal dog fighting operations throughout the city's southwest corridor. Neighbors reported hearing unusual sounds at night, barking, shouting, and what could only be described as animal screams. Animal control officers had found increasing numbers of injured dogs abandoned in alleys, many bearing injuries consistent with forced fighting. The D had traced drug distribution networks that seemed to center around illegal gambling operations, but they'd never been able to connect all the pieces into a prosecutable case. Emma's innocent observations had just provided the missing links. Lieutenant Sarah Kim from the Gang Intelligence Unit pulled up surveillance photos on her laptop, comparing them to Emma's drawings with growing excitement. "Look at this," she said, turning the screen toward the group. "We have thermal imaging from the warehouse that shows heat signatures consistent with large gatherings in the basement level. The layout Emma drew matches our technical surveillance perfectly, but she's provided details we couldn't see: the cage configurations, the spectator areas, even the positioning of what she calls the loud machines. Those loud machines," Dr. Walsh had explained during her debrief, were likely generators providing power for the illegal operation, while keeping the activities hidden from utility monitoring. Emma had also described bright lights that hurt your eyes, and lots of people sitting in circles, details that painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal enterprise, rather than the small-scale operations they had initially suspected. Detective Santos felt a mixture of pride and heartbreak as she watched seasoned investigators piece together the scope of what Emma had witnessed. The child psychologist believes Emma was exposed to this operation multiple times over several months. She explained, "Her mother appears to have been involved peripherally, possibly as a drug customer or low-level participant." Emma describes hiding behind the big box during multiple visits, which suggests she had regular access to observe the operation's structure and key personnel. The breakthrough that sent adrenaline through every officer in the room came when they compared Emma's description of the Spider-Man to their existing files on Miguel Hernandez. Not only did the physical description match perfectly, but Emma had unknowingly provided information about Hernandez's role that confirmed their suspicions about the criminal hierarchy. She described him giving orders to other men, controlling access to the fighting area, and handling what appeared to be large amounts of money, all behaviors consistent with being the operation's primary leader. "We need to move fast," Captain Hayes declared, already reaching for his phone to contact the district attorney's office. If Hernandez's suspects were closing in, he'll shut down the operation and disappear. We've seen him do it before in other cities. The next 4 hours transformed Emma's childhood trauma into the foundation for the largest, coordinated law enforcement operation Detroit had mounted against organized animal cruelty. Search warrants were obtained based on Emma's testimony and Ha's corroborating surveillance evidence. The FBI's Animal Fighting Task Force was contacted to provide federal resources and expertise. The ASPCA dispatched an emergency response team equipped to handle the rescue and medical treatment of potentially dozens of injured animals. As teams prepared for the coordinated raids, Detective Santos found herself thinking about the courage it had taken for Emma to share her memories. The little girl had no understanding of search warrants or criminal prosecution. She had simply trusted the adults around her enough to describe the sad doggies and mean men that haunted her dreams. Her 3-year-old sense of right and wrong had cut through the complexity of a criminal enterprise that had stymied experienced investigators for months. At 4:47 a.m., as the first gray light of dawn touched Detroit's skyline, coordinated teams struck 3 locations simultaneously. The primary target was the Corktown warehouse Emma had drawn with such disturbing accuracy. Secondary raids hit 2 suspected satellite locations where intelligence suggested injured dogs were housed during recovery periods between fights. The scene at the warehouse exceeded even the most pessimistic expectations. Emma's drawings had been heartbreakingly accurate. 23 dogs were found in conditions that would haunt the responding officers for years. The basement fighting arena was exactly as she had depicted, complete with spectator seating, electrical equipment for lighting and sound, and the cage configurations she had drawn with a child's attention to detail. Miguel "Spider" Hernandez was arrested at the warehouse along with 5 other men, caught in the act of preparing for what appeared to be a major fighting event scheduled for that weekend. The evidence recovered included detailed betting records, videos of previous fights, and medical supplies used to treat injured animals, all pointing to a sophisticated operation that had been generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal gambling revenue. As news of the successful raids spread through the police department, everyone understood that the breakthrough had come from the most unlikely source imaginable: a 3-year-old girl's determination to tell the truth about the bad dog she recognized had dismantled one of Detroit's most profitable and elusive criminal enterprises. Emma Martinez, who had been too traumatized to speak about her experiences for months, had become the hero who saved 23 innocent animals and brought justice to their tormentors. Her courage had transformed personal trauma into collective healing, proving that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most powerful truths. 6 months after Emma's brave testimony transformed a 3-year-old's whispered words into Detroit's most significant animal cruelty conviction, the same courthouse where her journey began witnessed the final chapter of justice being served. Courtroom 4B, where Emma had first encountered Ranger and spoken those fateful words, "bad dog," now hosted the sentencing hearing for Miguel "Spider" Hernandez and his criminal associates. Judge Patricia Morrison, a respected jurist with 30 years on the bench, had presided over countless criminal cases, but few had moved her as deeply as this one. The evidence presented during the 3-month trial had been overwhelming, not just the physical proof recovered during the raids, but the powerful testimony of a child whose innocent observations had unraveled an entire criminal network. Emma herself had not been required to testify in court. Her recorded sessions with Dr. Walsh deemed sufficient and far less traumatizing than forcing a young child to face her tormentors in person. "Mr. Hernandez," Judge Morrison addressed the man who had haunted Emma's nightmares, "your operation inflicted suffering on innocent animals for profit and entertainment. The evidence shows a calculated, systematic enterprise of cruelty that continued for over 2 years. The court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for 8 years. The courtroom erupted in quiet satisfaction, as advocates, police officers, and community members who had followed the case witnessed justice finally being served. Detective Santos, sitting in the gallery with several members of the Animal Cruelty Task Force, felt a deep sense of closure, knowing that Emma's courage had led to this moment. The 5 men arrested alongside Hernandez received sentences ranging from 3 to 8 years. Their lesser roles in the operation, earning them reduced but still significant punishment. The financial penalties were equally severe, over $2.30 million in assets were seized, including vehicles, property, and bank accounts linked to the illegal gambling and fighting enterprise. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of the sentencing hearing was the victim impact statement read by Dr. Jennifer Park, a veterinarian who had worked tirelessly to rehabilitate the 23 dogs rescued from the warehouse. These animals endured unimaginable suffering, she told the court, but today represents not just justice for their pain, but hope for their future. Every single dog rescued from this operation has found a loving home, and several have even become therapy. Animals themselves, turning their survival into service for others. Among those success stories was Duke, the golden retriever who had triggered Emma's initial traumatic reaction through his resemblance to the dogs she had seen suffering. After months of careful rehabilitation, Duke had overcome his own trauma and joined his littermate Ranger in the police therapy dog program. The irony was profound. The dog, rescued because of Emma's testimony, had become a healing presence for other traumatized children, completing a circle of recovery that began with one little girl's determination to speak the truth. Rosa Martinez sat in the courthouse gallery with Emma beside her, the little girl now 4 years old and thriving in ways that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Emma no longer needed the constant presence of Sparkles the unicorn, though the well-worn toy remained a cherished companion during bedtime. The severe anxiety that had characterized her first months with Rosa had gradually given way to the natural curiosity and joy that should define childhood. The transformation in Emma's emotional state had been remarkable to witness. Dr. Walsh's continued therapy sessions had helped the little girl process her traumatic memories in age-appropriate ways, while Rosa's unwavering love and patience had provided the stable foundation Emma needed to heal. The child who had once been too frightened to speak above a whisper now chattered constantly about her preschool friends, her favorite books, and her dreams of becoming a veterinarian to help all the hurt animals. As the sentencing concluded, several key figures in Emma's journey gathered in the courthouse corridor for an informal celebration. Officer Sullivan was there with Ranger, whose gentle presence had inadvertently started this entire chain of events. Dr. Walsh stood nearby, still marveling at how a 3-year-old's artistic expression had provided more actionable intelligence than months of traditional police work. Detective Santos found herself reflecting on how this case had redefined her understanding of witness testimony and the unexpected sources from which truth could emerge. The media attention surrounding the case had been substantial, but carefully managed to protect Emma's privacy. News outlets across the country had covered Detroit's littlest hero, though her identity remained protected and her role described in general terms that emphasized her courage without exploiting her trauma. A case had sparked important conversations about childhood trauma, the intersection of animal cruelty and other criminal enterprises, and the need for specialized approaches when working with very young witnesses. Perhaps most significantly, the case had led to substantial policy changes within the Detroit Police Department and child welfare system. New protocols were established for recognizing and documenting trauma responses in very young children, with Emma's case serving as a training example for social workers, police officers, and court personnel. The Child Advocacy Center received increased funding to expand their specialized interview capabilities, ensuring that future cases involving child witnesses would benefit from the lessons learned during Emma's journey. The financial restitution from Hernandez's seized assets was directed toward animal welfare organizations and trauma treatment programs for children. A portion funded the establishment of the Emma Martinez Memorial Fund. Though Emma was very much alive and well, Rosa had requested that her granddaughter's contribution be memorialized in a way that would help other children and animals for years to come. As the courthouse crowd began to disperse, Emma approached Officer Sullivan and Ranger with confidence that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. "Good dog," she said clearly, gently patting Ranger's head while the golden retriever's tail wagged approvingly. The simple phrase carried profound meaning, not just Emma's ability to distinguish between the therapy dog who brought comfort and the traumatic memories he had initially triggered, but her journey from victim to survivor to hero. Dr. Walsh observed this interaction with professional satisfaction and personal joy. Emma's recovery had been remarkable, not just in its completeness, but in how it had transformed a personal trauma into a force for justice and healing that would benefit countless others. The little girl who had hidden behind boxes in a basement of horrors had become a beacon of hope for anyone who believed that truth and courage could overcome even the darkest circumstances. Justice had been served, healing had begun, and a 3-year-old's determination to protect the sad doggies had created ripples of positive change that would continue long after the courthouse doors closed on this remarkable case. 1 year and 3 months after Emma Martinez first pointed at a golden retriever and changed the course of multiple lives with 2 simple words, she skipped through the familiar marble corridors of Wayne County Courthouse with the carefree confidence of a child who had conquered her greatest fears. At 4.5 years old, Emma no longer needed to grip her grandmother's hand for security, though she still chose to hold it out of love and habit as they made their way to a very special ceremony. Today's visit wasn't for legal proceedings or traumatic testimony, but for the dedication of the courthouse's new Child Witness Protection Memorial, a permanent installation honoring children who had found the courage to speak truth in the face of impossible circumstances. Emma's contribution to justice had become a symbol of hope for the entire legal community, inspiring new approaches to supporting young witnesses and recognizing that some of society's most important testimonies come from its smallest voices. The memorial itself was a work of art that would have made Emma proud. Local artist Maria Gonzalez had designed a bronze sculpture featuring a child's hand reaching upward toward a constellation of stars, each star representing a case where a young witness had helped bring justice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. The largest star bore a small inscription, "For the children who find courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Rosa Martinez walked beside her granddaughter with tears of pride in her eyes, still amazed by the transformation she had witnessed. A terrified, silent child who had come to live with her 18 months ago had blossomed into a vibrant little girl who spoke 3 languages, loved school, and spent her free time drawing pictures of happy animals in sunny meadows rather than the dark scenes that had once haunted her artwork. "Abuela," Emma said, pointing to a familiar figure approaching from the opposite end of the corridor. "It's Officer Jake and Ranger." Her voice carried pure excitement, with no trace of the fear that had once made her tremble at the sight of the golden retriever. Officer Sullivan smiled broadly as he and Ranger approached the small group gathering for the memorial dedication. Over the past year, he had watched Emma's relationship with his therapy dog evolve from terror to curiosity to genuine affection. Ranger, with the intuitive wisdom that made him exceptional at his job, seemed to understand the significance of his role in Emma's healing journey and always greeted her with gentle enthusiasm. "Hello, Emma," Officer Sullivan said warmly. Ranger was hoping to see you today. He's been practicing his best behavior for the ceremony." Emma giggled and approached Ranger with the confident movements of a child who had learned to trust again. "Good dog, Ranger," she said, the words that had once been impossible for her to say, now flowing naturally as she scratched behind his ears. "You're the goodest dog in the whole world." A scene attracted the attention of others arriving for the ceremony, including Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had played such a crucial role in helping Emma process her traumatic memories. Dr. Walsh carried with her a portfolio of Emma's latest artwork drawings filled with rainbows, smiling animals, and happy families that showed how completely the child had reclaimed her ability to envision a world of safety and joy. "Emma has become quite the artist," Dr. Walsh told Rosa, showing her some of the recent drawings. Last week she drew a picture of herself as a grown-up veterinarian, surrounded by healthy, happy dogs. The transformation in her art reflects the transformation in her heart. Detective Maria Santos arrived with several members of the Animal Cruelty Task Force, all of whom had followed Emma's recovery with personal investment. Santos had maintained contact with the family throughout the past year, not in any official capacity, but because Emma's courage had touched her so deeply. Watching this little girl overcome trauma to help others had reminded Santos why she had chosen law enforcement as a career. As the ceremony began, Judge Patricia Morrison took the podium to address the gathered crowd of legal professionals, law enforcement officers, child advocates, and community members. "Today we honor not just the children who have found the strength to testify in our courts, but the recognition that justice often comes through the most unexpected channels." Emma Martinez showed us that truth doesn't depend on age, and that the smallest witnesses can cast the longest shadows of justice. The most moving moment of the ceremony came when Duke, the golden retriever rescued from Hernandez's fighting operation, joined Ranger at the front of the gathering. Both dogs now wore their therapy dog vests with pride, Duke having completed his training and begun working with children who had experienced various forms of trauma. The symbolism was powerful. A dog saved by Emma's testimony, now helping other children find their own paths to healing. Emma watched Duke with special fascination, understanding on some level that this gentle, loving animal had once been one of the sad doggies she had described in her testimony. The transformation was complete, from victim to survivor to healer, both for the child and the dog whose lives had intersected in such remarkable ways. As the formal ceremony concluded, Emma was invited to place her small handprint in a special section of the memorial, adding her mark to a permanent reminder that courage comes in all sizes. Her palm, still small enough to fit entirely within an adult's hand, left its impression in bronze that would inspire future generations of children facing their own moments of truth-telling. The day's final surprise came when Dr. Jennifer Park, the veterinarian who had rehabilitated the rescued dogs, presented Emma with a special gift, a certificate, naming her as an honorary junior veterinarian and a promise that when she grew up, she would always have a place in Dr. Park's practice if she chose to pursue her dream of helping animals. "You've already saved more animals than most veterinarians save in their entire careers," Dr. Park told Emma. "When you're ready to help even more, we'll be waiting for you." As the ceremony ended and the crowds dispersed, Emma sat on the courthouse steps with Rosa, both of them looking up at the memorial that would stand as a permanent testament to the power of a child's voice. The little girl who had once hidden in basements to avoid seeing terrible things was now honored in bronze for her courage in speaking about them. "Abuela," Emma said thoughtfully, "do you think the doggies know they're safe now?" Rosa's eyes filled with tears as she considered her granddaughter's question. "Yes, mi amor, I think they know. And I think they know it's because of you." Emma nodded with satisfaction, then spotted a small sparrow hopping on the courthouse steps. "Come on, Abuela," she said, jumping up with typical 4-year-old energy. "Let's go home and draw pictures of happy birds." As they walked away from the courthouse hand in hand, neither grandmother nor granddaughter looked back at the memorial bearing Emma's handprint. They were too busy moving forward, toward a future filled with the possibility that truth and courage could overcome any darkness. The little girl who had once whispered "bad dog" in terror had grown into a child who could confidently declare "good dog" to the world, and in doing so, had reminded everyone who heard her story that sometimes the most powerful voices belong to those who have the most important things to say.